Hi guys, welcome to my channel. My name is ReadingBear and I hope you are ready for some more stories. And today, we'll take a look at some new entitled people content. If you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comments. And now, let's dive right into the stories.
The first story is titled, Farmer built a 25-foot hay tower after entitled city neighbor cut down his hedge and damaged his property. TLDR. City businessman buys farm lot next to me to expand. Tries to buy my property and when I refuse to sell cuts down my hedge to build a sign. I decide to build a 25 feet tall wall of hay bale so that now nobody can see his advertisement from the street. It is on my property and within my rights, so he can't do anything about it and now is stuck with a useless sign that nobody can see from the main road. Maybe try being nicer to your farmer neighbor and he wouldn't have to get revenge on you. Hello everybody, my friend told me about all the stories regarding farmers being posted lately and thought that everyone would love to hear what happened between me and my neighbor. Next to my land used to be another farm, but with rough times it closed, and the plot of land went up for sale. Some guy in the city decided he was going to buy the land to expand. See, this guy already had a business and the only thing between it and my land was that farm lot. When he bought it he basically just got to expand, and before he even did anything I knew that this guy was an entitled jerk that really didn't care about anyone else around him. I swear the only good parts of my day was when his business was closed, and he went back into the city to sleep. Just to give a little example of why I hate this guy so much, I am going to tell you all a conversation that I had with him. Now this is actually the first time I ever met the guy, and it was right after he decided to buy the land next to mine. Him. Hello, my name is, and I own, business. I just purchased the land next to you and was wondering if you were interested in selling. Me. Listen, I'm not selling my property. He didn't seem to like that answer and instead continued talking. Him. I could really put this land you are living on to some good use for my business. And this way you get money and can afford to move somewhere else without any financial difficulties. Me. My land is being put to good use now, growing crops and raising livestock. I'll say it again, I'm not interested, and you aren't getting my land. Him. Well, don't come crawling to me looking for a handout when you go broke, and I swoop in and buy the land for half of what I would now. I closed the door in his face and couldn't imagine the nerve that this guy had. The first time meeting me, and instead of acting like a neighbor tried to make me sell him my land. I know that for this story I call him a neighbor, but honestly I feel like that word should be used for someone that has even a little bit of respect for you. Anyway, I knew that it could only go downhill from there, and it wasn't the first or last time I would have issues with this guy. For starters, it wasn't the first conversation we would have about him trying to get me to sell him my land. The second thing was that for a while he was using the empty farm lot as extra parking for people coming to his business. Now that he was expanding though, he needed new places to park and for a while encouraged customers to park on my land. I put up signs that anyone parked there for his business would be getting towed, and that seemed to put a quick stop to it. Finally, things came to a boil when he decided that the land he got just wasn't good enough and needed to encroach onto my property. I don't have a tradition fence around my land, and instead I opted for a more natural and green approach to using a hedge to separate the properties. I was proud of that hedge honestly, and I put a lot of work to making sure that it was neat and presentable. Imagine my shock when I see one day that half of it is just gone. I am furious. I can see the person that is doing it and I run up yelling at him about destroying my hedge. He explains that neighbor hired him to remove it and claimed that it was from the old farm property and didn't know it was mine. He stopped at that point, but half of my hedge was just gone, and I wasn't going to sit down and take it. I could see my neighbor looking at me really smug and knew that he knew it was my hedge and he wasn't done trying to mess with me. He built one of those tall advertisement signs so that people can see it from the main road, and it would basically tell them that his business was there. He took down my beautiful hedge to replace it with a giant metal advertisement. Since it was on his property though, I couldn't do anything about the sign. Also, I was told that suing him for the hedge was possible, but courts were backed up for things like that and it would take a while to get anything done. I was left with only one option, and that was to teach this guy from the city that messing with people out here is a bad idea. I thought about trying to put some new shrubbery in or something so the giant hole between properties wouldn't exist, but then I got a much better idea. On the other side of my farm were bales of hay lined up that was going to be the feed for the livestock in the winter. Looking at it though gave me a crazy idea though, and I knew what I was going to do. Since they were flat and basically looked like giant bricks made of hay, they could stack on each other easily. They were also heavy enough that even stacked they weren't a danger of getting blown away by the wind. I started my plan, and I took them over to where his sign was, but on my side of the property, and started stacking away. After about 25 feet of stacking hay bales, I thought it looked good enough and went to get my truck for the final test. I got out on the main road and drove down keeping an eye out. I could see my stack of hay and it was totally blocking neighbor's business sign. Nobody could see it and he wasn't going to get any business from the main road like he wanted to. As you can imagine, he came over and started yelling at me that he was going to sue me and destroy me. I calmly told him that it was on my property and as a farmer I needed to have hay. I also needed to block the area of the hedge that got destroyed so my animals could stay safe. That last part wasn't true because they were safe in their own areas on the other side of the farm, but he didn't need to know that. I know that if he got a lawyer he was going to hear the same thing I did about the courts being backed up and that technically I can do what I want on my side of my property. There were no laws about how high you can stack your bales of hay either, so I knew I wasn't doing anything illegal. I know that when things finally get to it the courts will try to make us come to some arrangement. In the meantime, though, I get to enjoy seeing my giant wall of hay every time I have business that takes me on that main road. I can see that he also isn't getting the kind of business that he wants to because people that don't know the area are going to go to the places that they see the signs for as they are driving. I was never going to sell him my property anyway, but I think by the time this entitled city guy is done fighting with me he wouldn't have the money if he wanted to. Maybe threats are how people in the city do business, but around here kindness goes a long way. If you want to act entitled and piss off a farmer, well then you are going to have to deal with him building a wall of hay between you two. The next story is titled, Duplex Destruction. TLDR. Racist landlady and STD-infected babysitter next door causing me no end of grief. I set out a masterful plan to ruin them both. Both of them now wish they'd never met me. A little over a year ago I moved to a smallish town. I found a decent duplex out on the outskirts, plenty of room for just myself. When I spoke to the landlord, or landlady I guessed, she had implied that she'd had quite a few other people look at the place, but that these weren't the sort of people she wanted moving in. It was heavily implied, though never explicitly stated, that she wouldn't allow minorities to move into her duplexes. I really didn't care, as it was none of my business, and as long as I could get the place I was happy. So, I moved in a week later, and at first, all was well. I work Tuesday through Saturday, 8 to 5 every week, though I frequently get off later than 5. My job consists of driving a company truck and going to customers' houses to fix their crap. I sometimes deal with as many as 10 different people a day. At the end of the day, the only thing I usually want to do is go home and veg out in front of my computer. The last thing I want to do is interact with other people or have to deal with a bunch of noise. Unfortunately, my neighbor was running her own daycare next door, watching as many as 10 or 12 kids in her little 1,000 square foot unit. She would allow these kids to run wild. My typical Monday, which was one of my weekend days, would consist of waking up at about 7 a.m. to the sounds of kids banging on walls and jumping on furniture and hearing my neighbor scream at the tops of her lungs. This would go on all day until about 7 p.m., with no respite. Now, I knew when I moved in that she ran her own small daycare, but I didn't think it would be a problem. After all, I used to watch kids as well, only I was good at it, and I made sure the kids I watched were well behaved. Naturally, I assumed that someone running their own daycare would have the skill to control the kids. Not so. After a few weeks of this I ended up losing my patience. I knocked on my neighbor's door and engaged her in small talk. I didn't want to immediately tell her to shut the fuck up, so I just made it seem like a friendly chat. During the small talk I realized that this bitch was nuts. This was the first time we'd ever talked, and within just a few minutes she was telling me that she had an STD. I quickly forgot her name, but I always refer to her by the nickname I gave her, Crotchrot. Well, after a few minutes of conversation with Crotchrot I decided to broach the subject of excessive noise. I started out by asking her if I was noisy, and assuring her that if I ever became noisy she could ask and I would quiet down. She assured me that she never heard a peep from me. She then asked me if she was noisy, to which I replied that there was an awful lot of noise during the day while she was watching kids. Now, I'm still trying to keep things civil and friendly, but things start going off the rails. She apologizes and tells me that running a daycare is noisy business. She explains that this is her only source of income, and she has no choice in the matter. I ask her if she's able to keep the kids from banging on the walls at the very least, to which she replies that she's one person with 10 kids, and she can't be everywhere at once. At this point I realize that being Mr. Nice Guy isn't working. This filthy witch is just going to keep making excuses and avoiding the issue rather than actually try to do something about it. I suggest that she either hire on some help or take some lessons to learn to better deal with young children. She suggests I move somewhere else, and that it was stupid to move in when I knew the next door unit was a daycare. Well, at this point I'm just pissed. This witch does a shitty job of running a daycare and handling children and has the nerve to call me stupid? I decide to go to war. Before going back into my own unit I make one more statement. Do you have a license to run a daycare? Well, it turns out that Crotchrot is good friends with landlady, and at the beginning of the next month when landlady comes to collect rent, she serves me an eviction notice, giving me 30 days to leave. Her explanation is that I'm causing tensions among the other tenants and being a troublemaker. Keep in mind, the only other tenant I've spoken to has been Crotchrot. Well, neither of these witches know who they're ducking with. I'm the last person to just roll over and take it in the ass, especially when I feel that something unjust has been done. I do my research and learn about my state's childcare laws. I learn that there is a limit to how many children an unlicensed facility can care for, which is also based on how many caregivers there are. I also learn that there are certain requirements, such as state workers inspecting the facilities and doing background checks on the caregivers. All of that licensing information is public domain, so I do a search, and sure enough, my neighbor is unlicensed and illegally watching children. After that I do some research on housing equality laws in my state. Turns out it's illegal for anyone, even a private owner, to discriminate against potential tenants on things like race, sex, religion, etc. First things first, I call up the Department of Child Protective Services and report my neighbor. I explain that she's unlicensed, that she's clearly unable to handle the children she's watching, and that I frequently hear banging and yelling coming from her unit, which has me concerned for the safety and well-being of the children. A bit of a fib there, but I figured I should spice it up a bit. Well, much to my surprise it only takes about an hour before 2 CPS agents and a couple of police are pulling up in front of the duplex. They force Crotchrot to call each of the parents to come pick up their children, then explain to the parents that if something were to happen to their children that they could be held liable for leaving their children with someone who isn't equipped to handle them. Crotchrot ends up getting slapped with a hefty fine and an order to appear in court. For the first time since I moved into that duplex, I was happy for the thin walls. I just sat there drinking a few beers and listening to all the chaos. It went on for hours. I slept like a baby that night. So, Phase 1 of Operation Duplex Destruction was complete. Crotchrot was ruined. I destroyed her only source of income, permanently, caused her financial distress in the form of a fine, and got her in trouble with the law. It was time to proceed to Phase 2. By now most of my stuff was packed and I'd found a new place to live a few miles down the street. A couple weeks after moving to my new place I invited a few of my coworkers over to have a few beers, though I had ulterior motives. It just so happens that I invited 2 black coworkers and a white coworkers. After we'd had a couple beers I explained the real reason I wanted to get together. I'd been working on a plan to get back at some racist cunt of a landlady, and I was ready to put the plan into action. Fortunately, me being such a likable guy and on great terms with all my coworkers, they were more than happy to go along. I went ahead and had one of my black coworkers call up the landlady and ask about her for rent listing and set up a time to meet her and check the place out. I instructed my other black coworker to wait a couple days and do the same, and instructed my white coworker to wait until the end up of the week to do the same. A week and a half came and went. During that time all 3 of my coworkers had met with the landlady to check out the unit. She told my 2 black coworkers that she'd already found another tenant, and sent each of them on their way. But when my white coworker showed up later that week, she told him that she hadn't found anyone to rent yet, but that she'd had some unsavory characters show interest. Well, this was more than enough for me. I got in touch with my state's Commission on Human Relations department. I explained that I had referred a few friends to check the place out, and that the owner of the properties was blatantly refusing to rent to minorities. I also called up the NAACP and explained the situation to them. It's now been about 2 months since all of that happened. I checked back with the NAACP this morning to ask for an update on the situation. Racist landlady was slapped with a fine, and is currently being sued by the NAACP for tens of thousands of dollars. Operation Duplex destruction is a success. Edit. I just want to thank all of you that have left comments of support and upvotes. I'm surprised this got so much attention, but I'm glad you all enjoyed my explanation of these events. If anything else happens, I'll be sure to update this post. As of right now, I'm living in a new place with quiet neighbors and a landlord that stays out of my business, so I couldn't be happier. The last story is titled, The Self-Entitled Elderly Lady. Was listening to one of those Ask Reddit Read Out Loud things, and it was a story about toilet horror stories, and it made me remember an encounter with an elderly EP a few years ago. I had a Fulkerson's osteotomy on my knees, both done about 6 months apart. For those curious about what it is, the front of the shin bone is removed along with a tendon, and grafted to the inside of the leg to realign the knees. As part of the fun, I had to wear a Zimmer splint for 6 months after each to allow the graft to take and strengthen. Zimmer splints are fun. It goes from your crotch to your ankle and locks your leg straight. A pain in the butt and many other areas, especially when sitting. Because the knee can't be bent, you just sit there either a straight leg. Anyhow, to the EP. I was about a week post-op. Been on a metric ton of oxycodone all week. Causes the conveyor machine to back up a bit. A couple days of everyone's favorite conveyor machine repair substance, laxatives, found me at a shopping center. A very familiar bubbling rumble started through my gut, and I knew it was time. The abomination that had made its home deep inside my bowels was ready to depart, and I had to exorcise this demon. With the Zimmer splint and crutches, I made the Usain Bolt to the nearest appropriate facility at Warp 9.5, and thankfully found the disabled toilet was available. I settled in and started to meditate as I prepared for the task ahead. With a bit of gentle persuasion, reciting the correct prayers and even asking Odin for a favor or four, the demon started to push out into the open world, looking for its next host. Both the demon and myself battled. The demon didn't want to leave, and I had to rid myself of it once and for all. An epic battle raged in that little disabled toilet in a Westfield shopping center, a battle that none know of but had implications for the plight of humanity itself. We battled, and eventually I had won. The demon was in a place of where it needed to be. Finish the business. Wash my hands, because if you don't you're a grot, and hobble out of the disabled toilet, exhausted but knowing what had to be done, was done. Come face to face with this elderly lady, screaming at me that being lazy isn't a disability and I should use a regular toilet so people like her can use the disabled toilet. I know she was elderly and all, but surely she could see that at point I was in fact disabled by the very definition of the word. I pointed that out and copped the young people are so rude speech. She pushed past me and went into the disabled toilet. I made sure to thank her for reminding me that being disabled isn't a disability, and apologized for the inconvenience as I heard loud coughing and dry retching come from behind the now closed door behind me. That demon had found a new home. Thank you for listening.